This is Dennis Callan for Hawaii Geographic Society's World Traveler, taking you on another journey to Europe. In today's program, we're going to spend the entire hour in Prague. Prague, the capital of the Czech Republic. It's an amazing city. The history of Prague dates back about 1,000 years, and most of the buildings that we see today go back to the time of the Baroque period. So they're about 300 years old, and some of the buildings are older yet, especially around the town square. This is where you find some of the oldest structures of Prague. Some were built in a medieval Gothic style, and others rebuilt in the more florid Baroque style you see here. Notice the blend of the new and the old, personified in this wannabe Mozart salesman who's got tickets for tonight's concert. There's music in the streets in Prague, and there's music in half a dozen concert venues most nights during the season. It has a grand history. We'll share some of that with you as we wander through the streets of the old town. Many notable buildings are found around the Old Town Square, including the Baroque Church of St. Nicholas. Beautiful, large, white, grand Baroque church, and in front of it is a monument to Jan Hus. He was a Protestant reformer, and in 1415 he was burned at the stake as a heretic by the Catholic Church. It led to a series of wars called the Hussite Wars, and this continued for many years. A lot of disputes and struggles between the Catholics and the Reformers, the Protestants, culminating finally in the 30 Years' War in the early 17th century. That was a disaster. It killed almost 2/3 of the population. The old town hall tower, you walk right up it. There's a spiral ramp. You pay a slight admission and you walk up. There's no elevator here, but it's not that bad, and when you get to the top, you get a fantastic view. It's well worth your efforts. Be sure you bring up lots of film. You don't want to run out of film at the top and have to run down and back up again, but when you have the film, you'll be rewarded with these fabulous sights. All around you are the old rooftops of Prague. Most of these buildings are 300 years old, some of them 600 years old. It's really an ancient town. Looking down on the town square, there's a bit of a crowd gathered. The old tin church is the Gothic landmark that stands proudly over the town square. In many ways, it's one of the symbols of Prague, along with the Charles Bridge. People are gathering down below because there is an hourly event that takes place when the clock strikes the hour. We'll show you that coming up in just a moment. Looking off towards the Jewish part of the old town, we'll walk you down there shortly. We'll show you their famous cemetery and town hall. You're watching World Traveler. This is photographed during our regular tour of Europe. In this case, we travel from London to Prague by train, and Prague is the grand climax of our trip. And the climactic point of the city is Prague Castle, standing high on the hill overlooking the town. We can see it all from the top of the tower of the old town hall. It's really a fabulous view and well worth your time. It only takes 10 minutes to walk up and have a look up top for 10-15 minutes and 10 minutes to walk back down again. All in all, it's a well-spent half an hour. It gives you the classic overview of the city, and you'll get photographs that look like they belong on the cover of a book. Another feature of the tower is the famous astronomical clock. This clock was first designed back in the year 1400. It carries on a medieval tradition common in most of the important cities of Europe, with the main clock in the town square. And even today it puts on a show every hour. That's why these crowds are gathered here. The lower portion does not move, but it's a beautiful painted panel depicting the monthly labor cycle of the rural people. The action happens in the upper area of the clock, where the apostles spring to life, and they appear in these two windows once every hour, and they parade through and depict the virtues and vices of life. And there's Bony Death ringing his bell. This clock not only tells time and puts on a show, but it has astronomical symbols and pointers and interlocking circles that also register the phases of the moon, the length of the day, the equinoxes, the dates of innumerable mobile feasts, Babylonian time, but it's the apostles who steal the show here. This clock was first designed in the year 1400, but the legend says the designer was blinded by the king, for the king never wanted him to design a better clock. The designer then destroyed the mechanisms of the clock, and it wasn't until 1572 that it was patched up and has been running ever since. The town hall is still functioning as a wedding place, a great picture backdrop for your wedding ceremony. They go in and do the ceremony in the town hall, have their license signed, and come on out for a photo op, and all the tourists get a chance to take a crack at them too. Surrounded by all the Baroque and Rococo splendor of the square. It's a glorious sight. The streets leading out from the square will take you on several other adventures. On the one side we have the river, and the other side is the new town, and heading north we enter into the Jewish old town. Some of these grand streets leading to it were created in the 19th century. The Jewish town hall was built back in 1570 in a Renaissance style, and then it was redesigned in the late 1700s in this beautiful Baroque fashion. And even today it still functions as the town hall for the Jewish community. The clock runs backwards. Just as Hebrew is read from right to left, the clock spins counterclockwise. There's the old new synagogue, and then there's the Jewish cemetery. This contains nearly 12,000 headstones, but 100,000 graves. They're buried 10 deep. The Intercontinental Hotel is a grand 5-star complex that dates back to the Soviet days, and nearby is some sidewalk cafes. The Jewish community of Prague has a proud history. It claims to be the oldest and at one time the largest Jewish community in Europe. The overall history of Prague itself is a fascinating story, and it helps to explain why Prague today is such a beautiful city. So as we look at the buildings and the grand surroundings of Prague, it's worthwhile contemplating the history of how we got here, how were buildings such as this covered with the beautiful Skravito created, and why are they still standing today? And why is this town pump, built in a gilded medieval style, still here today? How did all this come about? How was Prague created? And how did it survive? Well, it's a long story, as you can imagine, and as we wander these narrow back alleys and look at the grand buildings, we're going to weave our commentary back and forth to tell you what happened in the ancient past, as well as some comments about what we're looking at today, such as the Country Life restaurant. Now, this is a great place for a quick lunch, a stand-up, inexpensive lunch. They have pasta salads and a variety of beverages to go with your food of choice. Eating in Prague can be relatively inexpensive, particularly when you get away from the old town square and get into the more local neighborhoods. And this certainly is a good option. You can picnic out on a bench amidst these splendid surroundings. The historic character most responsible for shaping the ancient plan of Prague that we see today was Charles IV, Emperor Charles IV, who reigned in the early 1300s. He was the great builder whose architects constructed several of the important Gothic masterpieces we see today, including the St. Vitus Cathedral up at the castle, and the Charles Bridge, named after him, across the river, and the old town tower of the Charles Bridge, the tin church looking over the town square, and then Charles IV had the new town laid out. He was a visionary leader whose influence is still felt today. This set the ground for the strength of medieval, middle-aged Prague. These trams might look like something from the ancient past, but in fact they are a very modern and contemporary way of getting around, even though their history goes back 100 years. First opened in 1891, the electric tram has been in operation ever since. Its predecessor was the horse-drawn cart on rails, which started in 1879. And this form of transportation is so efficient that it's still a very popular way of getting around today. Charles Square is another of the great landmarks of town that was laid out by the Emperor Charles IV. He had studied at the University of Paris in the 1320s and traveled extensively throughout Europe, making many contacts and learning from these other cultures, and brought much of this wisdom back to his hometown of Prague, where he founded the first university in Central Europe in 1348. And some of those students probably were drinking at this beer hall. U Fleku is one of the oldest beer halls in Prague. The origins date back to the 1450s. They serve this dark beer that's only found at U Fleku. It's today the smallest brewery in Prague, and it's a terrific gathering spot. You can hear some traditional music, enjoy the outdoor beer garden in the summertime. They do serve several kinds of dinner on a limited menu, but mostly you're better off here just coming for the beer, the music, and the atmosphere. Continuing on with Charles IV and his story, we can say that he was one of the great leaders of Europe. For under Charles, Prague became an important city, population of 50,000 people back in the 1380s. It was a university town. It had 100 monasteries and churches and chapels, and it was a cultural leader of Europe. It was the capital of Bohemia. A golden future path awaited the town of Prague, resulting in such buildings later, as you see here with the beautiful ornamentation and stucco motifs. These were built about 300 years after Charles IV. However, to get from Charles IV to the beauties of the Renaissance was a troubled path. The 1400s was a difficult time for Prague, as was the 1500s, and even on into the early 1600s, there was trouble brewing. There were internal strife, there was civil wars, there was disputes between the rich and the poor. The leaders remained ensconced up in the castle on the hill. The Germans were playing a role invading and trading. The Habsburgs also invaded the area, but somehow Bohemia was left alone for much of these strifes and managed to develop its own distinct culture. Bohemia, yes, the kingdom of Bohemia. We think of Bohemians today as hippies and beatniks and gypsies and wanderers, the Bohemians, the unconventionals, and perhaps a lot of that sprang from the cultures that flourished in Prague that developed in the 1400s. As you can see, the Bohemian city is still standing today, and it continued developing right up through the 1900s. The Art Nouveau style of architecture began to take hold, as particularly shown in the municipal building, a grand structure from the turn of the century. It's been closed for renovation for several years, and now it's completely reopened in all of its original splendor. The Municipal Cafe is one of the great gathering spots of the town, and night and day this is an active cultural center